A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Herman, I was thinking about that word weird this morning. It is funny how a single syllable can carry so much weight depending on who is saying it and what year it is. If you look back at the 2024 election cycle in the United States, weird became this sudden, sharp political weapon. It was used to pathologize people who did not fit a very specific, narrow vision of modern social progress. It was remarkable to watch it move from a playground insult to a high-level campaign strategy. But if you go back a few centuries, being weird or eccentric was almost a badge of honor for the upper classes. It is this shifting target that Daniel wanted us to look at today. And honestly, living in a house with you and Daniel, I feel like we are experts on the subject of being slightly off-center.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I will take that as a compliment, corn. It is a compelling prompt because the history of that word is actually quite technical. The term eccentric did not even start as a way to describe people. It entered the English language around 1685 as an astronomical term. It described orbits that were not centered on a single point. It literally means off-center. It was about celestial bodies doing things that did not follow a perfect circle. And then, by the late 17th century, we started applying it to human behavior. We started seeing people as having orbits that were a little bit skewed from the social gravity of the time. It is a perfect linguistic evolution, really. We went from describing the stars to describing the people who look at them a little too long.
That metaphor works perfectly. The idea that society has a center of mass, and most people are locked into a tight, predictable orbit around it. But then you had these individuals who are swinging out into deep space, or looping back in ways that do not make sense if you are only looking at the center. Daniel mentioned that he wanted us to explore where that line is drawn. Who gets to decide what is normal? Because if you are off-center, someone had to define the center in the first place, and that definition is often tied to power. If you have the power, you define the center. If you do not, you are just drifting.
You're right. And that definition is never static. It is a moving target. In the Victorian era, for example, they were obsessed with categorizing everything. They wanted a taxonomy for the human soul. There is this famous essay from 1892 by a doctor named D.H. Tuke called Eccentricity. We actually touched on some of these historical medical perspectives back in episode 817 when we talked about the origins of the neurodiversity movement. Tuke was trying to figure out if eccentricity was just a harmless quirk or if it was a precursor to actual madness. The Victorians were terrified of anything that threatened social cohesion, yet they also had this strange, lingering respect for the rugged individualist. Tuke argued that eccentricity was a sort of borderland. He called it the twilight zone of the mind. He was looking for a way to separate the creative genius from the person who just could not follow the rules.
Right. The eccentric genius versus the village idiot. It seems like the label you get depends entirely on your utility to society or your bank account. If you are poor and you talk to pigeons, you are a vagrant. If you are Nikola Tesla and you have a deep, spiritual obsession with a specific white pigeon while also inventing the alternating current motor, then you are a tortured visionary. Tesla is such a perfect case study for this. He had these intense, obsessive-compulsive traits, like a fixation on the number 3. He would walk around a building 3 times before entering. He required 18 napkins to clean his silverware. He could not stand the sight of pearls. If a woman wearing pearls sat at his table, he would literally lose his ability to function.
And he lived in the New Yorker Hotel, which is a very specific kind of insulated environment. That is what I find so interesting about the psychology of it. There is this concept in neuroscience called leaky sensory gating. Most people have a very efficient filter in their brain, specifically in the thalamus. It takes the massive influx of data from the world and shreds about 99% of it before it reaches the conscious mind. It keeps you focused on the task at hand. It is why you can have a conversation in a crowded restaurant without hearing every other fork hit every other plate. But in many eccentrics and creative geniuses, that gate is leaky. They have what we call low latent inhibition.
So it is not necessarily that they are choosing to be difficult or odd. Their hardware is literally processing more of the environment than the average person. If you are taking in 10 times the data, your output is going to look strange to someone who is only seeing the highlights. It reminds me of what we discussed in episode 819 regarding the twice exceptional brain. You have this high-performance engine, but the steering is calibrated for a different kind of road entirely. If you were seeing patterns in the way the napkins are folded that no one else sees, of course you are going to seem obsessed. You are reacting to a reality that is more crowded than the one everyone else is living in.
That is a sharp observation. And the research by Dr. David Weeks really backs this up. He did this landmark study called Eccentrics, a study of sanity and strangeness. He studied over 1,000 self-identified eccentrics over the course of several years. What he found was actually shocking to the medical community at the time. These people were not miserable or mentally ill in the traditional sense. In fact, they visited doctors about 40% less often than the general population. They reported higher levels of life satisfaction and happiness. They were less prone to the kind of low-level anxiety and depression that comes from constantly trying to fit into a mold that does not match your internal shape. They had essentially opted out of the stress of conformity.
So, in a sense, the eccentric has solved the problem of social friction by simply ignoring the friction. If you stop trying to force your orbit back to the center, you stop burning up in the atmosphere. But that brings us to the sociology of it, which is where things get a bit more complicated. We have to talk about the luxury of the insulated. Why is it that some people are allowed to be weird, while others are institutionalized for the same behaviors? This is the privilege question Daniel raised. If you have a safety net, your weirdness is a hobby. If you do not, it is a liability.
This is where the class dynamics and the geography of eccentricity come in. There was a piece in the Harvard Business Review a few years back that looked at this. They found that in high-status environments, like the aristocracy or top-tier academia or Silicon Valley, nonconformity is often interpreted as a signal of competence. They call it the red sneaker effect. If you show up to a board meeting in a hoodie and flip-flops, people assume you are so brilliant that you do not have to follow the rules. You are signaling that you have so much social capital that you can afford to waste it on being odd. But if a middle manager does that, they are seen as unprofessional or unstable because they do not have the status to back up the deviation.
It is the cost of admission. If you have enough social capital or actual capital, you can buy your way out of the requirement for conformity. Look at Lord Byron. That man was the 19th century poster child for weaponized eccentricity. When he went to Cambridge, he found out they had a rule against keeping dogs in the dorms. So, what did he do? He bought a tame bear and kept it in his room instead. He argued that the statutes mentioned dogs but said nothing about bears. He even suggested the bear should apply for a fellowship. He was using his status and his wit to mock the very institutions that gave him his platform.
That is such a power move. It is institutional defiance disguised as a joke. Byron knew his status protected him. He could lean into the weirdness because it enhanced his brand as the dark, brooding, unpredictable poet. He turned his idiosyncrasies into a shield. If people expect you to be odd, they stop trying to control you. They just say, oh, that is just Byron being Byron. It creates a zone of autonomy that most people never get to experience. He even had a custom carriage built that was a rolling library and a bar, so he could travel across Europe without ever having to engage with the world outside his own curated environment.
But contrast that with someone like Emperor Norton I in San Francisco in the mid-1800s. He was a businessman who lost his fortune and then declared himself the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. Now, by any modern clinical standard, the man was likely experiencing some form of delusional disorder, but the city of San Francisco basically adopted him. They let him inspect the streets, they printed his own currency which local restaurants actually accepted, and when he died, 30,000 people turned out for his funeral. He did not have the wealth of Byron, but he had the communal tolerance of a city that saw his eccentricity as a feature of their identity rather than a bug in their system.
That is a striking example because it shows a community deciding to maintain social cohesion by folding the eccentric into the fabric of the city rather than casting him out. They turned him into a living mascot. It was a form of communal tolerance that you rarely see today. Usually, we want to pathologize it immediately. We want to give it a code in the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders and put it in a box. We have lost that middle ground where someone can just be the local character. Today, Emperor Norton would be a viral video on a smartphone, probably being mocked or pitied rather than being given a seat at the theater for free.
Well, that is the modern tension, right? We've become so efficient at identifying and labeling neurodivergence that we might be losing the category of the harmless eccentric. If Emperor Norton showed up today, he would be on a heavy regimen of antipsychotics within a week. And look, I am pro-medicine, and I think it is great that we have help for people who are suffering. But there is a difference between suffering and just being different. If you think you are an emperor, but you are happy and you are not hurting anyone, and the community likes having you around, is that a medical problem, or is that just a very unusual life? We have traded communal acceptance for clinical management.
It is the difference between a bug and a feature. In Silicon Valley, they have built an entire economy on the idea that the bug is the feature. They reward disruption. They want the person who thinks so far outside the box that they do not even realize there is a box. You look at figures like Howard Hughes. His eccentricity eventually turned into something very dark and isolating due to his severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. But for a long time, that same intensity is what allowed him to revolutionize aviation and film. He was the ultimate example of the ecology of eccentricity. He created an entire corporate empire that functioned as a buffer for his growing oddness.
Right, but even in Silicon Valley, there is a limit. You have to be productive. If your weirdness does not lead to a unicorn startup or a breakthrough algorithm, the tolerance evaporates pretty quickly. It is a very transactional kind of acceptance. It is not like the San Francisco of the 1870s, where they just liked having a guy in a cape walking around. Today, you have to be the right kind of weird. You have to be weird in a way that generates venture capital. If you're weird in a way that just makes people uncomfortable without a return on investment, you are back to being pathologized.
And that brings us to the cross-cultural piece of Daniel's prompt. We are talking very much from a Western individualistic perspective. If you look at the work of Geert Hofstede and his Individualism-Collectivism Index, the United States is basically at the extreme end of individualism. We celebrate the outlier. We have this myth of the self-made man who defies the odds. But in a collectivist culture like Japan, the pressure to conform is much higher. They have that concept of KY, which stands for Kuuki wo Yomanai. It literally means someone who cannot read the air.
I have heard of that. It is a social death sentence in some circles. If you're the person who does not pick up on the subtle atmospheric cues of the group, you are seen as a threat to the harmony. It is not seen as being a rugged individual. It is seen as being selfish or socially incompetent. The nail that sticks out gets hammered down. In that environment, eccentricity is not a sign of genius. It is a sign of a lack of respect for the collective. It is curious how the same brain, the same leaky sensory gating, would be treated as a gift in a Berkeley lab and a failure in a Tokyo office.
Precisely. So the ecology of eccentricity is very much dependent on the soil it is growing in. In the United States, we have these little greenhouses for it. Academia is a big one. The tenured professor who wears mismatched socks and forgets to eat because they are obsessing over a 17th century manuscript is a trope for a reason. The institution provides the buffer. It says, we will take care of the mundane details of your life so you can go be brilliant in your weird little corner. We value the output of the eccentric enough to tolerate the process of their existence.
I wonder if we are losing those greenhouses, though. As everything becomes more corporate and more optimized for efficiency, there is less room for the person who does not scale. I mean, think about the way we use algorithms now to filter resumes or evaluate employee performance. An algorithm does not know how to handle an eccentric. It just sees a data point that is 4 standard deviations away from the mean, and it discards it. It sees the off-center orbit, and it tries to correct it or delete it. If you do not fit the keyword optimization of a modern life, you are invisible.
That is a terrifying thought, Corn. If we optimize for the mean, we lose the outliers, and the outliers are almost always where the innovation comes from. If you look at the history of science, it is just a long parade of people who were considered weird by their peers. Think about Francis Galton. He was a brilliant polymath, but he was also obsessively counting everything. He once tried to create a beauty map of the British Isles by secretly punching holes in a piece of paper in his pocket every time he saw a woman he deemed attractive or unattractive. He was trying to quantify the unquantifiable.
Okay, that is definitely on the weirder side of the spectrum. A bit creepy, actually. It is a perfect example of how eccentricity can veer into something that feels socially predatory or just plain wrong.
Oh, it is incredibly creepy. But that same obsessive need to quantify everything led him to invent the concept of correlation and the regression toward the mean in statistics. He gave us the tools to understand the very normal that we use to judge people like him. It is a strange paradox. The people who are the most obsessed with the center are often the ones who live the furthest away from it. Galton's brain was so leaky that he could not help but see the data in everything, even things that should have remained qualitative. He was a man who could not read the air, but he could certainly measure the wind speed.
It makes me think about the political dimension again. When we use weird as a slur, what we are really saying is, you are not part of the tribe, you are not following the script. It is a way of enforcing social boundaries without having to actually engage with the ideas. If you can label someone as weird, you do not have to listen to their argument about tax policy or foreign relations. You have already categorized them as an outsider. It is a shortcut to dismissal. And in 2024, we saw both sides of the aisle trying to claim the center by pushing the other side into the weird category.
And that is a dangerous road to go down, especially in a pluralistic society. If we lose the ability to tolerate the eccentric, we lose the ability to tolerate difference in general. Eccentricity is the canary in the coal mine for liberty. If a society can no longer handle a guy who keeps a bear in his dorm room or a woman who dresses like a Victorian time traveler in 2026, then it probably cannot handle a person with a genuinely different political or religious viewpoint either. The tolerance for the harmlessly odd is a measure of the psychological safety of a culture.
That is a deep point, Herman. If we are all on edge, we cannot handle any deviation. We need everyone to signal their conformity constantly, just so we know who is on our side. It is a very defensive way to live. It is like we are all walking around with our own personal air readers, making sure no one is breathing the wrong way. But for our listeners who are navigating this in their own lives, I think there is a practical takeaway here. We often spend so much energy trying to mask our quirks, especially in professional settings. We talked about this a bit in episode 681, the idea of unmasking and the shame that can come with being labeled as different.
But if you look at the successful eccentrics, they do not mask, they lean in. But they lean in strategically. That is the management of oddness. You have to find the right niche. If you are an eccentric, you probably should not be an air traffic controller or a middle manager in a highly bureaucratic government agency. You need to find an ecology that rewards your specific type of off-center orbit. You need a place where your leaky sensory gating is a competitive advantage because you are noticing things everyone else is missing. You need to find the greenhouse that will let you grow.
I also think there is a lesson for leaders and managers here. If you have a team that is perfectly uniform, you are going to get perfectly uniform results. You need the person who is going to ask the weird question. You need the person who has a different perspective because their brain literally does not filter out the background noise. As a leader, your job is to create enough psychological safety that those people feel comfortable bringing their whole weird selves to the table. You have to be the buffer for them.
And you have to be willing to provide that buffer against the rest of the organization. You have to be the one who says, yes, I know he is a bit odd, and yes, he refuses to attend meetings on Tuesdays because of some personal philosophy, but look at the work he is producing. You have to protect the outlier from the corporate hammer. If you can manage the oddness, you can unlock the genius. But it requires a level of comfort with ambiguity that many managers just do not have. They want everyone to be a perfect circle, but the most interesting things happen in the ellipses.
It is about valuing the output over the process. We have become so obsessed with the process of looking professional that we have forgotten that the goal is actually to achieve something great. And greatness rarely comes from following the standard operating procedure. It comes from the person who saw the procedure and thought, why are we doing it this way? This is ridiculous. I am going to do it this other way instead. That is the heart of eccentricity. It is a fundamental questioning of the center.
You know, it is funny we are talking about this on March 13th, 2026. We are in this era where artificial intelligence is becoming so good at mimicking the average human. Large language models are trained on the mean. They are the ultimate conformists. They are designed to give you the most likely next word based on the vast middle of human discourse. They are the statistical center of gravity. If we let AI-driven optimization run our society, we are going to prune away every eccentric branch we have left because an algorithm will never see the value in a bear in a dorm room.
That is a chilling thought. If the AI is the arbiter of what is normal, then anything that is truly original is going to be flagged as an error. True creativity is, by definition, an error in the eyes of a system designed to predict the most likely outcome. It is the unexpected. It is the off-center. We are moving toward a world where the weird is not just socially discouraged, but computationally impossible. If the system only rewards the probable, the improbable dies out.
Spot on. We need the eccentrics more than ever because they are the only ones providing the non-synthetic data. They are the ones who are still capable of genuine surprise. When Nikola Tesla looked at a pigeon and saw a soulmate, that was not an outcome any predictive model would have generated. When Lord Byron brought a bear to school, that was a creative disruption that an algorithm would have filtered out as a violation of the rules. We need the leaky brains to keep the system from becoming a closed loop of mediocrity.
So, maybe the call to action for our listeners today is to find that one thing about yourself that you've been trying to hide because it feels a bit too weird, and instead of masking it, try to figure out what it is telling you about the world. What is that leaky filter letting in that everyone else is missing? How can you turn that quirk into a tool? Because in a world of AI-generated perfection, your weirdness is your only truly unique asset. It is the one thing the machine cannot replicate because the machine does not know how to be wrong in an interesting way.
And if you are a regular listener, you know we have explored different angles of this before. If you found the neuroscience part interesting, definitely go back and check out episode 817 on neurodiversity. We go much deeper into the mechanics of the thalamus and how different brain structures lead to different social outcomes. And if you are interested in how this plays out in high-performance brains, episode 819 on the twice exceptional mind is a great companion to this discussion. It is all about that tension between high ability and high difficulty.
Also, if you are looking for that sense of community, the people who actually appreciate the odd and the deep, our Telegram channel is a great place to hang out. Just search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram. We post every time a new episode drops, and it is a good way to stay connected without the noise of the bigger social media platforms. It is a little greenhouse of our own where we could all be slightly off-center together.
And speaking of connection, we really do appreciate it when you guys leave a review. If you are listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, taking 60 seconds to leave a rating or a few words about why you listen helps other people find these deep dives. It tells the algorithms that there is still a market for long-form, weird conversations. It is our way of hacking the system to make sure the eccentrics can still find each other.
It really does help. You can also find our full archive and all the ways to subscribe, including the RSS feed, over at myweirdprompts.com. We have over 1,100 episodes now, so if there is a topic you are curious about, chances are we have poked at it from some angle. We have covered everything from the history of salt to the future of quantum consciousness.
Well, Korn, I think we have successfully orbited the topic of eccentricity today. I feel a little more comfortable with my own off-center tendencies now. I might even go out and buy a bear.
Please do not buy a bear, Herman. Our landlord is already on the edge with the telescope on the roof. I think we both do, though. It is a good reminder that being a bit weird is not a failure of character. It is just a different kind of trajectory. And in a world that is trying to pull everyone toward the center, maybe swinging out into the deep space of the unusual is the most important thing we can do. It is how we keep the world from becoming a perfect, boring circle.
I could not agree more. Thanks to Daniel for sending this one in. It was a great excuse to talk about bears and pigeons and the thalamus. It really highlights the thin line between what we call crazy and what we call brilliant.
Always a good day when those three things come together. But Herman, before we go, I was thinking about the future of this. If we are moving toward a more conformist society, do you think we will see a counterculture movement that explicitly embraces eccentricity again, like a modern version of the Romantics? A group of people who just refuse to be optimized.
I think we are already seeing the seeds of it. You see it in these niche communities online where people are reviving very specific, very odd hobbies or aesthetics. There is a hunger for the authentic, and authenticity is almost always a little bit weird. People are tired of the polished AI-generated perfection. They want the rough edges. They want the person who is obsessed with something for no reason other than they find it compelling. They want the human error.
The return of the amateur in the truest sense of the word. Someone who does something for the love of it, regardless of whether it makes sense to the rest of the world. Like the person who spends 10 years building a cathedral out of toothpicks in their basement. We need that person.
Precisely. The amateur eccentric. I think that is a noble goal for 2026. To be an amateur at life, to do things that do not scale, and to be perfectly happy in an orbit that no one else understands. It reminds me of Lord Byron again. He had a carriage custom built that was basically a rolling library and a bar. He would just sit in there and read while he was being driven across Europe, ignoring everything outside. He created his own mobile center of gravity.
A portable orbit. I love it. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, stay weird.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep